The summer of 1999 was when fans proudly proclaimed Star Wars is back with the release of Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace. George Lucas brought the franchise out of retirement in the first official movie release since 1983's Return of the Jedi. While the film itself was an endless sea of both online and offline discourse, there was no denying that fans both new and old were getting a fresh new dose of canonical content from the original creator himself. As with the original movies, merchandising was key to the success of this new film and ultimately the new trilogy, so it should surprise no one that all venues for such products exploded. Whether it was traditional action figures, clothing lines, novels, and of course video games, there was no end to the Star Wars marketing train. One hurdle everyone had to work around was the wide 3-year gap between 1999's release of The Phantom Menace and 2002's follow-up, Attack of the Clones, necessitating some creative thinking for games with varying degrees of success. One of the titles that piqued my interest was holiday 2001's release of Star Wars Obi-Wan on the original Xbox. When my friend Allie from the podcast 42 Level 1 reached out to find a way to play the game without an Xbox, I was shocked to find I had no good answer for him. This title never released on other platforms despite many plans to do so. It's not backward compatible on the 360 or the newer Xboxes, and if you aren't aware, Xbox emulation is taxing and spotty at best. This was one of those titles on a big-name franchise that is seemingly stuck on a specific platform for the rest of time. Having never played the game before, I decided it was time to not only check out this one-off oddity, but also share my findings and opinions. Let's kick it all off with the game's development history. Obi-Wan was developed in-house at LucasArts with George Lucas himself overseeing the project as a whole, although I bet his involvement was relatively hands-off. Development began in May of 1999, and the game released in December of 2001, putting roughly 2 years for development when you factor in pre-production, certification, and release. Dan Connors was director, his first design role as far as I could tell, and before that he worked quality assurance in both regular and managerial roles for many of the classic LucasArts releases for the 90s. Connors was also responsible for establishing a partnership with LucasArts and Microsoft Gaming Zone, but that was for the MMO Star Wars Galaxies, and I'm pretty sure isn't relevant to this title. Many of you may also know Dan Connors as one of the founders of Telltale Games, which would go on to release a bevy of licensed games before having a tumultuous series of events leading to the studio's closure in fall of 2018. Since then, Telltale has seemingly bounced back, complete with a return of most games to digital stores and even new releases. The overall design was handled by Christopher Ross, who had done art on Rebel Assault and Dark Forces before moving into a full-blown design job for Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2. Given his previous work and track record, it doesn't surprise me that Obi-Wan was originally rumored to be a follow-up to Dark Forces 2. It was originally supposed to be a third-person action title where the mouse mapped to the lightsaber for combat. Dark Forces 2 was a PC exclusive that introduced Force and lightsaber combat to what is essentially a Doom clone. So given what's in this title, all the rumors line up to be plausible, if not fully accurate. In November 2000, IGN suddenly reported that Obi-Wan was canceled for the PC and that production had moved to the upcoming Xbox, Microsoft's first console. It should be noted that a GameCube and Game Boy Advance port were also planned, but due to other projects in the timeline, these versions were scrapped. The Microsoft Xbox premiered in November of 2001, launching with a handful of titles including the powerhouse Halo Combat Evolved. Just one short month later, coming out a week before Christmas, Star Wars Obi-Wan released in the launch window, making it one of the earliest titles and yet another big-name franchise exclusive for Microsoft to celebrate. With the established talent, companies, and claims being made around this title, you would think it may be an unappreciated gem, so I played through it, and here are my impressions. Before I get started, I want to mention that a number of viewers out there have no doubt nostalgia for this title. Whether it's growing up with it, your love of Star Wars, Obi-Wan as a character, or anything else, I will not see what you see when playing this game. I did not play this when it came out, and I don't share your passion for it. Gaming is all about experiences. Different experiences, and that's what I love about it. Hopefully fans of this title will see my criticisms, both good and bad, as the observations they are and not be discouraged by these comments. I have no vested interest in these opinions other than my own. The first thing that stands out about this title is how you control Obi-Wan's lightsaber. At this time on consoles, we basically have the controllers that exist today, but developers had very different implementations of controls. Your left stick controls Obi-Wan's movement as expected, but the right stick is used for the lightsaber. I haven't experienced these kinds of controls in any other title than Too Human by Silicon Knights on the Xbox 360, and this was far earlier. Not only that, but it feels good. Running around in these early areas and cutting down foes with the flick of a stick is as effortless as it would be for our Jedi. This is a gameplay hook that can keep me going when a title starts to bog down progress. Your 3 different slash positions are represented by the left, right, and up directions, and down allows for blocking and deflection of blaster beams. If you want to zero in on a character, the right trigger will latch to the closest enemy, akin to the Z targeting mechanic we first saw in Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. As things get more chaotic in late levels, the lock-on leaves much to be desired, as it will toggle between foes randomly and frequently lose targeting altogether, which is frustrating. You also cannot change the enemy you focus on, relying only on dropping your lock-on and moving closer hoping that it will select the foe you want. There's also no camera control at all, not even a recenter button, so you are at the mercy of a pretty lackluster AI-controlled camera, with little you can do about it save shifting focus with a lock-on enemy. Still, Obi-Wan attains enough ways to handle enemies that it wasn't a deal-breaker, even in the murkiest of fights. On that subject, you are a Jedi, so it's not just lightsabers at your control. Plenty of force powers are also at your disposal. Holding down the left trigger will activate your force powers and create a blue circle underneath your feet. While this is active, your jump is at least twice what it normally is in both distance and height. Your lightsaber attacks become more powerful, giving you new ways to injure an enemy and with devastating force, but I only found this useful in the one-on-one battle sequences. You're also given force levitation to move objects with the use of the B button, although it just lifts up nearby items and either tosses them or throws them at enemies. Finally, there's the force push with the Y button, allowing you to toss enemies backwards, even off cliffs or into walls, killing them instantly. All of these moves and the deflection ability use up force powers, which regenerates slowly, but you will find burning through your force easier than you'd expect after those first few levels. It does seem balanced though. Even in the later levels, I felt that the limited force was the game's way to make Obi-Wan not a godlike character. Force powers and Jedi is something LucasArts and other developers will constantly tackle with, and even in more recent examples like The Force Unleashed or Jedi Fallen Order, there has to be some conceit that it is a video game after all and you have to have a fail state. From a technical standpoint, this title holds up pretty well when compared to others at the time. Many of your environments are open, in fact a little bit too open as I'll get to later, but it makes them feel like a realized 3D world as opposed to the smoke and mirror corridors of the previous generation. There are also some muddy colors, with specific characters like the protocol droid from the beginning scenario of The Phantom Menace, or members of the Jedi Council. At the same time, I was impressed by the lighting engine. Shadows appear on the ground where characters walk, light hits them in different cascading forms, and the signature glow from the lightsaber is always present. Interior lighting and flames cast a more realistic light, and water has expected reflections with decent quality. Perhaps it's all this recent ray tracing talk that has me noticing, but while I'm struggling with occasional graphical anomalies, I couldn't help but notice these touches as I traversed an area. Game development is a large team effort, and this title in particular makes the talent of individuals more prevalent, which is perhaps an attribute of most titles of this era. I haven't had enough experience to say for sure. I also have to say that while the sound design is acceptable with the signature Star Wars sound effects properly utilized, the intermittent fade in and out of the orchestral scores from Episode 1 were off-putting. There are many times where I'm just running around with no sound at all save for perhaps the pitter-patter of footsteps or a fountain splashing. Unfortunately, that's where my positives with this game basically end, because it's not only a product of its time, but clearly this development was rushed and several items were overlooked. Let's start with the items that were just indicative of the time. Those who own consoles in the early 2000s could expect these flaws in most games. If you're going to play this title today, you should be aware of these gripes because they may be a deal breaker for you given this title is almost 20 years old. I've already mentioned there's no camera control, but I think it should be reiterated. You can't directly control the camera, save for a slight realignment if you lock onto an enemy or the sway of perspective as Obi-Wan rotates his position. This means that traversal can be clunky, and you'll be falling off more random cliffs or walkways than you'd think. There's even some particularly mean layouts where you have to drop down and land on a platform below, but you have no idea where these are, nor do you have a great way to see them. Sure, there's the cumbersome set of binoculars you can always use to look around, but often level geometry can block your view. The result is leaps of faith that often end in death. Also, why is Obi-Wan injured and sometimes killed by falling a few dozen feet? Surely a Jedi that can make 10-foot leaps in the air can handle a 25-foot fall, and even some cutscenes show these acrobatics despite your character landing and dying instantly in the game. It reminded me of classic games like Spelunker or Donkey Kong, and I was surprised to see it return here. Also on the subject of lives, you can only die 4 times before having to restart a level from the beginning. Given that most of these levels are multi-part and there's no lack of obstacles you don't know about around each corner, the back half of the game is a combination of trial and error combined with memorization. Typically after having to restart a level, you find you can blast through it with ease. Come to think of it, I guess it's somewhat similar to the way From Software's Soulsborne series handles, clunky combat and all, but I'd hardly call Obi-Wan the Dark Souls of Star Wars games. And finally, escort missions. This game uses them far too much as a crutch to ramp up the difficulty, but unfortunately the scenario writers didn't really consider how common it is for the AI to lose focus. Running the same Protect Person X scenario will have vastly different results on each life. Sometimes the enemies rush straight for the target, other times they run off and attack other people on screen, and of course the rest of the time they go after you. Given that you have no blaster, there's little you can do if an enemy attacking you decides to stop at a distance, turn and shoot at a target in the opposite direction. You just have to try again. By the final protection escort mission with Queen Amidala, I failed nearly a dozen times, and the one time I did succeed was more luck of AI behavior than anything else. Now, these final gripes are valid regardless of when they came out. The development team should have addressed these items before shipping. Keep in mind that developers always know these items exist, and I'm sure this title is no exception. It's just that the project leadership decides what is acceptable and what is not if the time runs out. If I were to guess, that's exactly the case here. The time just ran out, and they had to ship. If you're one of those players who thinks there's far too much tutorialization in games, Obi-Wan is the game for you. Nothing is explained to you, down to the control scheme, unless you consider accessing the training option in the main menu. I have no idea why this isn't something you run through as part of the campaign, but without it, I started up on that first Coruscant level, unable to figure out how to use my lightsaber. Sure, perhaps I should have tried wiggling that right stick, but it was a straight line and I was confused. I assumed the right stick was for camera motion. This continues when it comes to where to go next, objects being vaguely phrased, and most notably how to deal with enemies. Basically, it works out that you see a new obstacle or enemy for the first time, you die once or twice figuring out how to handle them, and then hope you can still complete the level without having to restart the whole thing over. Also, the items you collect to assist Obi-Wan, like a sniper rifle blaster or ion grenades, become necessary weapons in later levels, and the controls are as awkward as any I've seen. You need to select the weapon with the D-pad, press up on the D-pad to equip it, and then press a random button per weapon to use it. For the sniper rifle blaster, it's clicking in the right stick, whereas for ion grenades, it's holding the down direction on the right stick and releasing it. Now imagine having to do this in the heat of combat without your lightsaber and a bunch of foes around you. Not fun. Also, like the rest of these issues, you're given no instruction on how these items operate. Yes, it's in the manual, but few people will have the manual, myself included, and unless you're savvy enough to dig one up online, which I did, you will get frustrated and possibly stuck. The one-on-one combat is also too complicated and simply not enjoyable. What starts off as a sparring with either melee-wielding foes or Jedi ends up making almost no sense. You have a relatively limited number of options for attacking enemies with your lightsaber, and later in the game, there's simply no telegraphing which move will be effective. So what did I do? I cheesed it, of course, which is not what the developers intended and not fun for me. If I was fighting a Jedi, I got out the old circle strafe technique from Doom and simply circled around my opponents, slashing wildly. If it was a melee weapon-wielding droid, I'd push them to the ground and then hit them while they were down. That's basically it for the many one-on-one encounters you'll get, save for the Tusken Raider Chief near the end of the game. I had no idea how to beat him fairly, and eventually I learned that I could throw all the torches around him, and then he was down to nearly no life. Even then I barely survived. This is also paired with the difficulty, which is not selectable, and the disappointing way in which the developers handle it. As the game goes on, the enemies don't change, and neither do the scenarios in many cases, but the damage you take goes up and the damage you inflict goes down. I find this to be a lazy alignment of difficulty, and yet it still happens even in games today. But it surprises me to see LucasArts employing this technique. As previously stated, I think the game was rushed, and that was a solution to the later levels. While we're on this subject of this game being rushed, it may also explain the awkward campaign storyline. The loading screen depicts the three main phases of Obi-Wan Kenobi: the Padawan from Episode 1, the Jedi Master from Episode 2, and the aged legend of Episode 4. That's counter to the game itself, which is only a side story prequel to and the events of Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. In fact, the plot is 2 chapters of Obi-Wan on Coruscant as a young Padawan, then it takes you to Naboo, then to Tatooine where you never see Anakin, and finally back to Naboo to finish up. The trip to Tatooine sees Amidala kidnapped by Tusken Raiders, but no cutscene explains this, it's just given to you in a line of text. Then we see Obi-Wan slaughtering an entire Tusken Raider village, killing the chief, and taking back Padme. This didn't happen in the movie and honestly aren't the behaviors of a newly appointed Jedi in the first place. The return to Naboo is also odd, so much so that even in the game, Qui-Gon Jinn questions it outright.
We had to return to Naboo?
Yes.
To me, the game was originally 3 chapters, 2 before Episode 1 and 1 during the events on Naboo. Someone in leadership must have questioned this and said it seemed too short or limited in scope, so the Tatooine level, yes, just 1 level and a boss fight, were thrown in to increase the game by half an hour and give a laughable additional setting and chapter. It's completely out of place, and it shows. What's even more odd is that at the end of the game, we see Obi-Wan promising to train Anakin, but unless you've seen the movie, you have no idea who Anakin is because he's never introduced in the game itself. That tells me not all the pieces were created, and when it came time to assemble the game, they just had to make do with what they had. When you put it all together, this isn't a very good or enjoyable game. The combat was always good at bringing me back in, but eventually some stupid design decision or technical oddity would pull me back out. I'm not a fan of adventure games, and the way you had to get into the level designer's head and try to figure out where to go was ridiculous. This is especially obvious in the mines, the Tusken village, and the mission grounded at the Naboo palace near the end. Many of the battle scenarios are also set up to have you fail, and nothing is of course explained. Even the final battle threw a curveball out of left field that I would have been much more frustrated with had I not been lucky enough to beat it the first try. This game is for big-time fans, those with nostalgia, or those that are incredibly patient and enjoy the design of this time period. I think this title was rushed, tweaked in the middle of development, and from what I can tell, it isn't a thing like the original PC title that was scrapped. So there you have it, a comprehensive look at Star Wars Obi-Wan on the Xbox. I really wish I knew what the original concept of this game on PC was like, because it had a completely different team and gets special thanks in the credits. It's not that I think the PC team would have been better suited, but more that I think this was a salvaged product where something too ambitious for hardware at the time was converted into a Microsoft exclusive launch title. Who knows what the game could have been, but the title we got is a lackluster action game hedging on its license from the creators themselves. If you like the video, be sure to subscribe or check out my other work on this channel and at gaminghistory101.com. Until next time, this is Fred Rojas saying peace out.
Choose the Force. Choose a job. Choose the dark side. Choose the Council. Choose a flubbing big lightsaber. Choose protocol droids, holoprojectors and R2 units. Choose Watto, Tatooine and Alderaan. Choose fixed interest credit payments to Sebulba. Choose a Corellian freighter that did the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs. Choose a Wookiee. Choose sitting in Jabba's throne room, watching mind-numbing dancers, stuffing green tubers into your mouth. Choose rotting away at the end of it all, disappearing into thin air, nothing more than an embarrassment to the whiny kid you trained on the way to Alderaan. Choose your destiny. Choose the Force. But why would I want to do a thing like that? I chose not to choose the dark side. I chose something else. And the reasons? There are no reasons. Who needs reasons when you've got a lightsaber?